Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives.
Hey weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cup of tea. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is here to tell us that he's not sick, but he has lost some flesh. Welcome, Darrell Buxton. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here and really looking forward to a chat and a cuppa.
Now then, so have you been busy? You seem like you're always kind of busy floating around stuff and doing stuff.
Yeah, I've got loads on at the moment. I'm editing We Belong Dead magazine, which I've been doing for just over a year now. Took over from Eric McNaughton, who I know you've had on the show. And Eric's still very much around as part of We Belong Dead. He now describes himself as the publisher, and he sort of oversees everything and sort of does a lot of the picture research still for the magazine, and has puts in a lot of opinions and ideas and things. But I've sort of taken over his job as editor because he just run out of time to sort of commit to that part of the magazine, and I'm having a great time doing that. We've just put out issue 38, which is our blaxploitation horror special, so which covers films. People think of blaxploitation as being a 70s thing, but we've looked at black cinema in terms of horror movies. We've got some going right back as far as the 1910s and then right up to date with sort of current releases. So we've covered over a century of cinema in there, and it's been a nice little way of doing like a little alternative history of horror, really, you know, the films that sort of fall between the cracks. And that's one thing I like to do with We Belong Dead. We did a French special earlier in the year as well, and again that was very similar. It was taking a batch of films that are connected by nationality, but showing the sort of diversity and the differences and the age range there as well. Obviously, the horror film was born in France, so we're looking right at the birth of cinema, and then coming right up to date with people like Julia Ducournau. And again, in covering French cinema, we managed to do this sort of whole alternative history of horror, you know. So these specials are going to be something that we carry on doing with the magazine. I'm really enjoying doing that, and got loads of other irons in the fire as well. So, you know, maybe we can talk about some of those later.
Yeah. Eric is. I think you probably keep trying to lock him in the cellar, but he keeps escaping, doesn't he?
I think so. Yeah.
The beast that cannot be killed. He's there. Yeah, he's a good lad. Eric is. I like Eric a lot. Yeah, and We Belong Dead as well. It's just for those that don't know. I mean, we talked about it on Eric's episode 5, and yeah, it's just a great celebration of horror, and I think initially it was a kind of celebration of more classic horror, but I think it, you know, certainly it has moved on to other areas. I mean, you've got the Euro horror coming up, and you know, you different sort of streams of ideas, you know, and certainly the stuff I've written for We Belong Dead, it hasn't necessarily just been that classic stuff. I've done, you know, silent films to sort of things like the fairly recent Spanish film The Bar, which was came out kind of just a year or so before the sort of lockdown, but it soon became very, very sort of prescient very, very quickly. So yeah,
it's still a very, you know, because of what that film is, it's still a very current movie, you know, and yeah. We're doing things like the books and so on, which are great. They're a really good sideline, and I'm proud to say as well that although Eric's a bit of a global traveller now, and you know, he does his sort of tours and things with groups of travellers and so on, and he seems to be jetting all over the world all the time. Me and you, I know, are both based in the East Midlands, and I'm proud to say that We Belong Dead was born in the East Midlands, because Eric was living local at the time it all started in 1992-93. So
he was. I mean, didn't know at the time, but he was living. I think he moved out around about the time I was moving there. So I grew up in sort of Mansfield and Sutton, and but then I moved to Nottingham when I was like 20. No, sorry, I a bit older than that. I was 27, I think, when I moved to Nottingham. But but I lived in Forest Fields for quite a number of years, and I know Eric lived in Forest Fields too, and he was kind of just across the way, really. So we kind of missed each other by a hair's breadth, I think, So and also because I do a lot of stuff at Broadway in Nottingham, so I guess in some ways you're my or I'm your sort of contemporary at Derby Quad. So you kind of do similar stuff, I guess, like intros and things like that, and all that kind of stuff at the cinema. So
yeah, me and you sort of dovetail quite nicely in that respect, because I've got contacts at the Broadway, and as you've said, you do bits and pieces at Quad as well. So we do sort of cross paths occasionally, but we manage not to tread on each other's toes. I'm doing a lot of the stuff at Quad that you do at Nottingham. So it's great. I introduce a thing called Fright Club every month, where we show a late night horror movie on a Friday or Saturday. That's done once a month, and we've been running that since about 2010 on and off. And we've just shown Sugar Hill, actually, the 1974 movie, which tied in with the blaxploitation issue of We Belong Dead. And then we've got The Exorcist coming up, and a lot of good stuff planned for next year. But I've done a bit of teaching at Quad as well, and I do lectures there and presentations. So yeah, very similar to the sort of stuff that you're doing over just over the way at Broadway.
So Darrell, obviously We Belong Dead and all that kind of stuff. Big horror fan. What was your entry point into horror then?
Okay, that's an easy one to answer. Like a lot of people, I'm sure it was Doctor Who, but unlike a lot of people, I go way back with Doctor Who, because I was born in 1962, so I'm 61 years old now, and my very earliest TV memory, well, I'm sure I was watching stuff on TV before this, but it's all things I can't remember. I know I was a big Batman fan, because in the Adam West era, because I remember playing with Batman toys in the backyard at home when I was about 4 or 5. But my very earliest TV memory that I can remember watching was The Web of Fear, which then, of course, episodes went missing for years until they were sort of rediscovered recently. But I think there's still one episode missing, isn't there, of Web of Fear, the Yeti story, and so I will have actually seen that when I was 5 years old, and I remember being terrified by that series. Obviously, I would have been watching Doctor Who as well, but that's the one that I can remember quite vividly. And I remember my memories of being really, really scared by it. And the thing that scared me about it was it wasn't sort of on-screen action. It wasn't the appearance of the Yeti. It wasn't anything to do with sort of confrontation or anything. It was scenes of anticipation. It was the Doctor and the troops and people around him waiting in the underground for something to happen. And that really, really got to me at 5 years old. And I thought, okay, I know something scary is coming. I don't know what it is, but the way everyone's reacting it's coming through the screen, and it's getting to me. That fear is getting to me. And I'm as big a fan as you'll find of gore and what my missus calls blood and guts, and I love the extremes of horror, but that first memory is of that sort of anticipation and that sort of quiet horror, which I can appreciate just as much as I can people having their heads and arms locked off, you know. But yeah, so Doctor Who Web of Fear was my very earliest memory. The first horror films I remember watching, again, were TV experiences, as they are for a lot of our generation. And the very first one would have been on a matinee slot on ATV sometime in the early 70s. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is a great way to start your horror film viewing. But not long after that, and I've heard other fans of a similar age say this as well, there was a late night screening, and it must have gone around the country because I know people from all over the country that saw it. It was Michael Armstrong's Haunted House of Horror was shown on late night TV, and it seems it was one of the first films that a lot of us stayed up for, and I've spoken to a lot of people about this. And of course, that's a particularly violent film in parts. Even now, it's got sort of shocking scenes in, even though it's sort of, you know, getting on for 55 years old. But so yeah, Haunted House of Horror, and again watched on a tiny little portable black and white TV in a holiday chalet, as I remember. So you're not seeing it as you would now on a big sort of widescreen Blu-ray or whatever. Yeah, tiny little image on a little TV while I was on holiday. So yeah, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, Doctor Who The Web of Fear, and then the real meat with Haunted House of Horror.
Yeah, it's coincidence because obviously that they've just stuck, well, all the kind of surviving episodes of Doctor Who, of classic era Doctor Who on BBC iPlayer. So I was kind of working my way through a lot of those. So I'm just working my way through Patrick Troughton at the minute, because obviously I've seen some of the Patrick Troughton stuff before, but it wasn't, you know, I was born in 70, so I came in at the tail end of John Pertwee, really. I remember John Pertwee, and I remember the maggots, and, you know, that's one of my earliest memories. The Green Death. And so obviously Tom Baker was more my doctor. But but it's interesting working my way through those Patrick Troughton ones. And Web of Fear, I recently did watch the Web of Fear, which is it's a great one, that is, because it's just mad, it's mental. People forget, you know, it's like kind of people are always shonky sets and, you know, bad costumes, but it's just fucking mental. It's like, where does this come from? Where does this idea come? So we've got Yetis, but they're not really Yetis, and then they're being controlled by this, and then they've got this strange kind of web thing, and it's like, what the fuck is going on? It's great. But I love the way, I mean, I love it. But I get why people might be frustrated by it, because they, you know, taking, you know, I'm watching the one story I'm watching at the minute is The Invasion, which is the Patrick Troughton Cyberman, and it's like it's fucking nuts, because it's like, you know, they're episode 5 before they've introduced the Cyberman. It's like, how would, you know, now you've got Doctor Who episodes of 45 minutes, you know, it's done.
You pack a whole story into
which is kind of
under an hour.
You know, I appreciate that as well, but sometimes I think you need more of a slow burn. And I think that was, you know, I'm not gonna, you know, if Doctor Who is, you know, more recent Doctor Who is special to people, great, that's fantastic. I hope they get a lot of enjoyment out of it. I like some of it. It's not always to my cup of tea, but I do think that classic Doctor Who, there was something about that slow burn. There was something about that creepiness, you know, particularly in a lot of those, you know, Tom Baker episodes from later on. It was, you know, it was perfect for that time. It was, because it did fit into science fiction, Nigel Neal stuff, folk horror. It was all of that combined. There's something very odd about it, you know. I mean, I'm reading at the minute. I managed, very lucky, I picked up a copy of Scarred for Life, the 70s volume 1 book, which I've been after for years, but it's like rocking all shit. It costs a lot of money, and I managed to pick it up for £2.50 in a charity shop. So working my way through that. But yeah, the Doctor Who section in that is good, because what they do, they don't really talk about Doctor Who as such, but they talk about everything that happens around Doctor Who.
They're good at that, those guys, and I think they do manage to get that whole era into, you know, packed into those, in between those covers, and The whole book's a nice read, and it all works as a piece. Even though they're doing sections on individual shows, you can tell they're all coming from the same place. And isn't it great that we grew up in that era when all of this stuff that people might think of as a bit weird and a bit strange, it was just what was on telly for us. It was just all right. We had 3 channels. You switched on, and you were more than likely to see something, whether it would be a show like Doctor Who on BBC, or Children of the Stones on ITV, or a public information film. Even they'd pop up in between shows on BBC One or BBC Two. And it was just what happened to be on television. In the way that if you turn on the TV now, it might be Big Brother or something. It was just what was on. So there was this weirdness sort of in the air and in the airwaves, it was. We just soaked it up and thought, oh, this is normal, and it was only years later when TV began to change that I think we started realizing, no, we really did grow up in a very, very special time.
Special and terrifying.
Which made us the people we are today.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't have had it any other way. But you look back, and especially if you go back and you thumb through, Scarred for Life, it is very much they were out to get us.
Oh yeah,
they were out to psychologically damage us. We're either going to be fixated on horror or nervous wrecks, or possibly both.
But then again, Andrew, I mean, talking about COVID and things like that, as we were earlier, something like that comes along in the world, and we're the best equipped people to deal with it.
Yes, we are.
We've learned from Tom Baker, and we've learned from all our TV heroes how to deal with global catastrophe. And there you go.
Yeah, I'm also, people take the piss out of me. I've talked to a few younger people, and you just mentioned the fact that you still buy Blu-rays or whatever, and they're like, "What? That's not a thing. That doesn't exist anymore." It's like, yeah, I'm just waiting till your favorite streaming site crashes, and then I can sit here with my fucking thousands of Blu-rays, and I'm not going to invite you round.
Exactly. I think people are starting to see that now. It's you're seeing articles online every week about this, and people are starting to get the message.
So yeah, I was talking about this last night actually. I'm not against. I think potentially streaming is a great thing. And I think what the ones that tend to be really good are the ones that are more curated. If you think about your Shudders and your Arrow online, that's really great.
They're more like an equivalent of your boutique Blu-ray labels, aren't they? And again, it's the boutique labels that have rather taken over the Blu-ray market from the majors. And the best streaming services, as you say, are the ones that take that same approach.
But I think a lot of the streaming services, the problem is, I think that the business model is beginning to be questioned. Because if you can, like, I unsubscribed from Netflix a few months back because it was too much money. I wasn't accessing it. And I know exactly that when the next series of, I really like Cobra Kai, it's a great fun. As soon as that next series is announced, I'll get a free subscription. I'll tan the whole series, and then I'll end a free subscription. And I just think that's what people are doing. It's like, and also there's this thing of like, well, okay, with Netflix particularly, if they pay for a production, so say they get a director to come and make a film, and they put it straight onto Netflix, and it doesn't get a physical release or a cinematic release. If they don't see that as having done very well, they can just take it off. So as a producer or a director, you've made nothing because it's disappeared.
No, and I can't believe that one of my very, very, very favourite films of the last 10 years or so, Ballad of Buster Scruggs, funded by streaming, played on streaming service, and has virtually disappeared. There's no physical release, and I've been collecting the Coen Brothers films over the years. I love their stuff. I've taught on them about them at Quad, and love their films. And then suddenly there's this gap in my collection where's the Blu-ray?
It's a fantastic film, that is.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. And a great anthology film, a great
Oh
Coen
yeah,
Brothers
yeah,
film.
and it's got elements of horror in it as well, and
Well, tapping into what we're looking at today with Tod Browning.
but yeah, I mean, as you say, we're talking about Tod Browning today, so I'm ready to crack on whenever you are on and shift into well, shall we say, unknown territory.
Yeah, so we are going to be looking at the 1927 silent film The Unknown, as directed by Tod Browning. When was the first time you came across this film?
Early 90s was the first time I had the chance to see it. I'd read about it in a few horror books before then, but it was weird that it only got fleeting passing mentions in all the great horror film books that we remember from the 70s, Dennis Gifford, Alan Frank, and so on, never mention this film. And if you look back at those books, there's a lot of gaps and a lot of films that they didn't mention and didn't cover. And I'm quite interested in those gaps, and I'm interested in why were there certain films that didn't get coverage. And The Unknown is one of them that sort of falls through the cracks, even when it does get mentioned, as it does by people like Carlos Clarence and Ivan Butler. It tends to be only one or two lines in passing in a sort of longer piece about other Chaney and Browning films. And so, yeah, early 90s, I was, as a lot of us were then, I was trading tapes with people through the classified ads in Samhain and so on. And I got friendly with this guy from Italy called Maurizio, and I did actually go and visit him in the early 90s as well. Spent a lovely week with him and his wife in Biella, just underneath the Alps in northern Italy. Had a great time there. And Maurizio, we'd trade magazines, records, tapes, all kinds of things. One day this package arrived in the post from him. I opened it up, and at that point I'd seen Chaney in things like Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, and so on. I'd seen a couple of Browning films. I'd seen the film that he did with Chaney, The Unholy Three, by that point. And and I'd read about all their stuff in books and devoured information about them. But this package turns up from my pal in Italy, and there are two VHS tapes in it. And there's four films on the two tapes, and they're all Browning Chaney movies. There's The Road to Mandalay, there's The Blackbird, there is West of Zanzibar, and there's The Unknown. I'm thinking, I've got gold dust here. This is fantastic. And Maurizio let me know. He sent a letter with them, and he said, "Oh, these have all just played on French TV, and the French contact has taped them for me, and I knew you'd want to see them as well, so I've sent them to you." And I played all those in a single afternoon because, of course, they're all fairly short. I mean, the version of The Unknown that was around back then was only 48, 49 minutes. Road to Mandalay was technically a lost film, and the only footage that existed is about 32 minutes, I think. Whether any of that has been rediscovered since, I've not looked into. But at the time, The Unknown was about 48 minutes. Road to Mandalay was about 31, 32. And then the Blackbird and West of Zanzibar, I think, were available in longer versions. But even then, even their full versions only ran to about an hour. So I sat down and just watched them one after the other. I got through the whole lot in about 3 or 4 hours. And it was just a marvellous, marvellous day, picking up on all these rare Chaney Browning films. And The Unknown, out of all four, was the absolute standout, and I'll go into the reasons why as we talk.
Yeah, I don't think I actually. I mean, I came across it as such, obviously in those kind of books we were talking about, and there's a famous image of Chaney sipping his, appropriately enough, sipping his cup of tea with his feet,
Yes,
which is great, And so I was aware of it, and I was kind of aware of the story and how bonkers it was and perverse, and we'll get into that. But yeah, I don't think I actually saw it properly till about 5 or 6 years ago, and I've watched it again recently because I was covering it at the Broadway. But unfortunately, I've only seen the 50-minute version because I, like everybody else, I ordered the new Criterion Blu-ray with Freaks, The Unknown, and The Mystic. But I've kept it, and I've cracked it open this morning with the intention of rewatching The Unknown, the full version. Fucking discs won't work. So I've had to fucking send them back.
I've heard that from one or two other people. I've played mine, and mine play fine, but I have heard from other people that there have been problems with some of the discs. So, but yeah, they play fine on my player. So I have seen the longer version of The Unknown. The interesting thing about it is that I was wondering if there'd be like chunks of extra scenes, whole sort of sequences that would add to story, or I feared might take away from it, might. But playing it, it really plays very much like the shorter version that we're all familiar with, because the extra 10 minutes or so that's been found is dotted about throughout the movie. It's sort of little trims and things and little atmospheric scenes. And the major one is a sort of circus scene right at the very start of the film, where you're getting shots of the crowd and you're seeing their reactions to events that are happening in the ring, and it just builds up the atmosphere really nicely. And but yeah, what you haven't got, which I did sort of expect and did slightly fear, is there's nothing like, there's like a 10-minute chunk of a whole reel here that you've never seen before. It's all just bits and pieces. So I think when you do finally get a disc that works and you do sit down to watch the film, I think you'll find it's very much the film you already know, but really nicely enhanced and with a real nice atmosphere to it. Yeah, it's all these little trims and bits and pieces, just odd little shots here and there, and it all mounts up to about an extra 10 or 12 minutes. But it doesn't take away what we love about The Unknown.
Yeah, I was a bit. I've got quite a few discs, Criterion discs, and obviously, as soon as if it could have been anybody that sort of said they were going to re-release Freaks, particularly as they were re-releasing it with The Unknown and The Mystic. It's just a fantastic package. Yeah. And having scanned, even though I've not been able to see them, but having scanned the extras and stuff, it looks like there's some good stuff on those discs. But I have to admit, I love my boutique Blu-rays, but as soon as I heard it was Criterion, I did roll my eyes a little bit, because I just thought, I'm not saying it's a bad package, but I'd like to have seen what Second Sight or someone like that would do. Or it just felt like it was more of a fit for Eureka Masters of Cinema, to be honest.
I know where you're coming from. Yeah.
I just wanted the big box, and I thought for 40 quid, yes, you've got 3 films, you've got extras, but it's not a brilliant package. It's Criterion are very stingy in that, and I know this big thing of, oh well, it's the film that matters, not the posters. But something like Freaks, I want a fucking poster. I want a fucking poster. I want all that stuff. So it's nice, but it's not. I'd preferred it if it was someone else that kind of was more about the physical stuff as well.
I get that. And that's the thing. All of the boutique labels we've talked about all do seem to have established their own little identity, and there are ones that we know might be a better fit for this material.
So I mean, we'll talk about the ins and outs of this diabolical plot in a minute. But I obviously we can't talk about this without talking about Tod Browning, the director. Now, because he is, I think there's a handful of Tod Browning films which are some of the most interesting films ever made, I think. And I say that I don't necessarily think he was the best director in the world, but I think he was one of the most fascinating directors in the world.
And I'd agree with that.
And I think it's odd that obviously, Dracula was a massive success, but he'd kind of done all these silent films with and without Lon Chaney for studios like MGM before he got to Universal to do Dracula. And Dracula, as much as I like a lot of aspects of Dracula, it's probably his most vanilla film. It's not, and to say it's the film he's most. I mean, there's some brilliant stuff in it, and there's some absolutely bonkers stuff in it. We've talked about it before, but the bees in the coffins and the armadillos and all that. It's mental, So
Sure.
I love that first opening 20 minutes of Dracula are just superb. But yeah, in comparison to say this film or comparison to say Freaks or Devil Doll, it's well,
it's just not a typical Tod Browning film, is it?
No,
it's a great horror movie. It's a great example of that sort of early 30s, birth of horror, explosion stuff. But it's not typical of its director. I wonder how much of that is down to it being an early sound film as well. I think Tod never quite found his feet in sound cinema, and it's those late period silents, including The Unknown, where he's absolutely on fire. And in that team with Chaney, you've got one of the great movie partnerships there, right up there with De Niro and Scorsese, or John Ford and John Wayne. They're that big and that important.
Well, something like The Unknown and a few other films he did, but particularly Freaks, it was absolutely in his wheelhouse, wasn't it? This was his background. He was, he was a kind of carnival grifter, and
I mean, he literally did do that American dream thing of his early life history is he ran away and joined the circus. And then when he became a filmmaker, he made films about people who ran away and joined the circus.
But he's one of his most famous acts while he was doing was the living corpse thing, where he basically buried himself for 3 days. Obviously, there's a system of sort of oxygen pipes or whatever, but this idea that he's come to town, and it seems odd. Turn up to your town, carnival's in town, what's happening? This guy's burying himself. Great, let's go.
I know. And then he continues that in the movies then with he's doing the stuff at the carnival that other people won't do, and then when he becomes a film director, he's making the films that other people won't do. He's always on. He's like on the extreme of the extreme.
And I love one of my favorite sort of theories about Tod Browning, and I know David J. Scarl has talked about this numerous times, and I love it. I love David J. Scarl's books.
Me too. Yeah.
But this whole thing. I mean, I've not been able to get hold of Dark Carnival, which is his book specifically about Tod Browning.
Yes, which is super.
It
super
costs
book.
£1 million. I've tried to get hold of it, but I have got several other David J. Scarl books. I do like his stuff, but I love this idea that he posits, which I'm not entirely sure I agree with, but I just love the idea of it. This idea that the theory goes that Browning was a big drinker, because he made a lot of films for MGM initially, and then MGM kind of got sick of his alcoholism, so they kind of distanced themselves from him for a while. But there was this reported car crash, and Scarl posits that perhaps in this car crash he damaged certain parts of his anatomy. Let's not go too much into that, but his rude bits. And so Scarl talks about this idea of him having this castration complex, and it gets very Freudian, the idea of the doppelganger being a substitute for loss of eye or genital and all this kind of stuff, according to Freud. And yeah, you can say, yes, we're reading too much into it, but it is there.
It's a constant.
There are numerous examples in Browning's films where, Dracula is dead from the waist down. Obviously, Johnny Eck, Prince Randian, other images,
Yeah.
Cleopatra at the end of Freaks,
Yeah, I mean,
all that
literally
sort of-
in the original versions of Freaks and the
yes,
original scripts of Freaks, Hercules, the strongman, is literally castrated. You know, it actually happens, or is very very strongly implied. And there were scenes where he was seen as a castrato
yes.
singer.
Which doesn't work that way. You have to lose your testicles early on to stay a castrato. You can't just lose your testicles and suddenly be a
Yeah,
castrato. But
but yeah,
you know, this is
that's
Freaks.
the
Yeah,
magic of the movies for you. But so there's a literal example, and that was the nearest that Browning got to actually, putting something like that on screen. But as you say, the implied versions and the subtler versions of this theory are perhaps the better ones and the more interesting ones to talk about.
yeah. I mean, we'll come back to Lon Chaney in a minute, but there's absolutely. I know it's a popular sort of saying, and I don't use it because I think it's usually used by people who are fucking dicks. But this idea, but you can really apply it to this film. They don't make them like this anymore. They
Exactly.
really fucking don't.
Exactly.
Boy meets girl. Kind of falls in love with someone else. Original boy cuts his own arms off and then tries to pull the other one's arms. It's starring Lon Chaney and Joan Crawford.
Yeah, I know. But having said all that, as I say, I first encountered the film around 1990 when it was broadcast on French TV, and if you look at the films around that time that were coming out in Hollywood and beyond, you've got Alejandro Jodorowsky's Santa Sangre, which is pretty much indebted to the unknown. You've got a couple of years later, you'd got Jennifer Lynch's Boxing Helena, which is all about the character having their limbs lopped off. Tim Burton's Batman, and you can see the unknown, and you can see Browning and Chaney all the way through Tim Burton. But Batman has got a scene where the Joker goes to visit a doctor and forces him to do an operation, and that's all shot in very sort of expressionistic, sort of Caligari type way. But it's also a scene that is almost entirely lifted from the scene with Chaney and the Doctor in The Unknown, and there are plenty of other sort of examples. I suppose Burton continues that obsession in stuff like Edward Scissorhands, which again is about a character who's got no proper limbs, so yeah, it's weird how when the film was sort of rediscovered and was sort of brought to a wider audience in the early 90s, that it just seems to have happened to coincide with these themes becoming popular in if not mainstream movies, films that were on the cusp of the mainstream. I suppose you've got David Lynch. Twin Peaks is out at that time, so it's like what we were saying about 70s TV earlier on. There's this weirdness in the air, and a lot of it seems to be Tod Browning type weirdness, almost as though Browning was 60 years too early. He would have fitted right into that crop of films and TV that were being made in the late 80s and early 90s. And it's like he's a man out of time.
Well, this is not a Browning film, but one of the films I sort of point to from that similar era from 1933 was Murders in the Zoo. If you want a brilliant example of a pre-code film,
that absolutely goes for it.
It's just insane. I mean, tonally it's all over the place. We're not used to Hollywood films looking, sounding like that. Those pre-code, that was the thing about pre-code. People talk about the sex and violence and all that. Yeah, but it's also the weird tonal shifts you get. You've got this fairly failed kind of slapstick shtick, which is kind of the most less interesting parts of the film and the most dated parts of the film. But then you've got that sequence at the beginning of a guy having his lips sewn together, and walking towards the camera. It's brutal. And then the final scenes of getting, I mean, it's an actual snake as well. I mean, that's the thing. We're used to seeing kind of rubber snakes or whatever in these kind of films, but when you're seeing someone actually being crushed by a snake, it's an incredible film, I think. If anybody says, well, what do you mean by pre-code weirdness, that
exactly that would be the film that you'd pick out for sure. Still shocking even today, I think, and especially to audiences that think, if someone thinks they know what a 1930s film is, show them that and they change their opinion forever,
Yeah. I mean, I guess with the unknown, it's almost like a pre-code, obviously when we talk about pre-code, we're talking about 30 to 34, but this was kind of before that. So there were restrictions in place, but
and that and Browning and Chaney's West of Zanzibar do the same thing, because West of Zanzibar was remade during the pre-code era as Congo in a sound version. Different cast, different director. Chaney, of course, had died by that point, but both Congo and West of Zanzibar, which tell the same story, again, are films that are just so out there. They're so different to anything else that was around at the time, and they're very, very different to what came, sort of post code from sort of 34 onwards. And I mean, the unknown again is right in the middle of that, because as we're gonna talk about, what a bizarre movie, and you've been through elements of the plot already, and but I think this was Browning's territory. I think he, as I said earlier, he was like on the edge of the edge sort of thing, and I think he set out, certainly in his films with Chaney, to strive to just do something that was different to what everyone else was doing, because there were horror filmmakers around at the time. This is in an era when people weren't even using the term horror film, of course. That came later in the early 30s, but there was something in the air, and there were people like Benjamin Christensen, Paul Laney were regularly making these weird sort of dramas that weren't called horror films, but we now call them horror films. And so Browning had rivals. There were other people that were doing stuff in the same ballpark. And there is this sense that he must have been seeing the work of these other guys and saying, well, I'm going to push things a little bit further. And I've got Lon with me. He'll do anything I say. If I tell him to pull his eyeballs out or whatever, he'll do whatever it takes to sell this movie. And what a team they were! Absolutely made for each other, And I think The Unknown is, in some ways, it's one of the less extreme films for Chaney, but it's because he's not having to do the sort of heavy physical thing on it, like he did on things like Hunchback and Phantom of the Opera. The character in The Unknown, Alonzo the Armless, is not a sort of physical freak in the way that the Hunchback of Notre Dame is. He's got freaky elements to his personality, but he's got a freaky mind. That's the thing with this character. So for Chaney, it's not as much of a stretch as some of his other stuff, but it's a different role, and you can see why it would have appealed to him. For Browning, I think he's taking things further in The Unknown than he ever did in any other film. This is, if Browning's on the edge of the edge, this film is like the edge of Tod Browning.
Well, this is kind of, I think, obviously people watch films for different reasons, and we have different moods. And I'm not saying you can't have different genres. Of course you can, But I always think, if cinema exists, which it does, and you're going to use that medium, why make The English Patient when you can make this?
Yeah.
Why?
Exactly.
this is what it's for. This is just
Yeah.
this is, look, I'm going to put the most bizarre ideas onto celluloid, and I'm not going to offer you any excuses. It's just there, and it is just it's mad. It's brilliant, and it's just probably, alongside things like the Black Cat from a few years later, and obviously Freaks as well. It's probably one of the most just oddest, bizarre, perverse, subversive.
Yes.
Just
well, in those terms, we've talked a lot about Browning and Chaney. Let's look at Joan Crawford's character. Joan Crawford's the attractive young heroine of the piece. She's a nice character. The audience is rooting for her to be successful and have a happy life. She's got this mad thing going on in her head where she's terrified of men's arms and hands. Even the nice heroine, even the girl in the film is crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's the whole thing is a madhouse. It's not. There's no sort of handy, sane character on. I think the same thing can kind of be said about Freaks. It's even the clown character Frozo. There are hints there in his dialogue that there's something odd about, there's something missing. He alludes to the fact that, about before the operation, so he alludes to the fact that he's castrated again, as all this kind of stuff. So it's almost like, this is what I mean by Dracula, because obviously he was adhering very much to a strict kind of script, and it was his first sort of talking film, so there was all those kind of restrictions, but it ends up being Dracula at its worst ends up being just a cozy sort of parlor room discussion for too long. But here, and with Freaks and other, it is, he has created a Tod Browning, we might call it the Tod Browning universe now, or whatever, metaverse.
Well,
or whatever.
as we've already said, the Mystic has carnival scenes, and there's a film called The Show that came out, I think, 4 months before The Unknown, which is also sort of carnival based, and that's got a weird fucked up plot as well. And so Browning's got form here, and as we've already said, it came from his own background. A lot of this stuff will have been lifted from things that he'd actually seen and done in the carnival and in the circus. So the show isn't on the Criterion set, and it's the sort of missing film from that set. But I gather it is. There was some kind of crowdfunding campaign to get a Blu-ray release for that, and whether that's going to get a wider release next year, I don't know. But anyone who's picked up the Criterion set, look out for The Show as well, which is an ideal companion to these other three movies. But coming back to Freaks, and this ties in a little bit with The Unknown as well. What I love about Freaks is that the sort of obvious thing to do, and I think some critics read the film like this, and I don't think they're right. An obvious thing to do would be to simply switch things around so that the people in so-called normal bodies are the twisted ones, and the freaks in their sort of twisted bodies and the whatever deformities they've got are all nice, and that would be the switch. But the film isn't like that. I think Browning's genius is there are shades of darkness and light in all of the characters. And whether they're the circus performers or whether they're the more conventional people. I don't want to use the word normal people because they're not normal, but the sort of average sized and average shaped people, and the whole gang there are messed up.
Well, I guess the only one that has got sort of unquestioned redeemable features is Madame Tetralini. We don't know her backstory or anything, but she as far as we know, she's all right.
Her introduction in the film is lovely because you get those two guys who see the freaks having the picnic, and they're making all these insulting remarks about them, and she immediately comes on, is seen as like the mother figure, and defends them, and it's the first thing we see in the film is her defense of this group of people that are working for her, and she's like the den mother of, and it's lovely that you get those two characters who aren't seen again in the film. They're just there simply to come on and insult the circus performers, and that's there for a reason. That's there so that she can do that, and so that Browning can immediately give us this balance. Now, that's something you don't get in The Unknown, partly because it's a silent film and you'd be having to do it all with subtitles and title cards. But I think partly because that's not the game with The Unknown. I think he doesn't really want us to have any nice characters in that movie, and I think that's the difference between that and Freaks, is that as I say, even Joan Crawford in The Unknown is such a twisted character when you really look at what's going on inside her, and when she changes her mind, that's the bizarre moment, is when, oh, I hate men pouring me, oh no, I like it now.
The thing I like about Tod Browning at his best, like I said, I've been reading tons of H.P. Lovecraft at the minute. I love Lovecraft, and what I love about Lovecraft is that, not in a crass way, like a very much like, we have the MCU fashioned, thrown together, everything's connected. I don't mean, but I think you get the sense with Lovecraft, everything he writes, he's not just chucking you one story, he is giving you a piece of this huge thing that no one will ever really figure out or fathom, and it's something that was in his head. And I think you get the same sort of thing with like Philip K. Dick. Everything it's not intrinsically connected, but it definitely is connected, and you feel like you're entering his world.
It's all part of the same universe, and the characters have got the same sort of concerns and the same sort of little twisted things going on in their heads as well.
And I think that is exactly the same with Browning. But at his best, all of those kind of films, especially those silent films and Freaks, they all fit into this strange, odd, world that sits on the periphery of normality. And
this is why Chaney is such a good fit for him, and why they made such a good team, because Chaney had already had that going on in his acting career as well, where he'd made this little niche for himself as the weird guy, the guy who does the parts that nobody else will, And then Browning sort of formulating this idea of doing these odd films as well. You're seeing it in films like The Mystic and The Show, and then he and Chaney collide, and you get this 2 or 3 year period where we've got this little knot of films, and the guys are made for each other. They absolutely are. And I think you've got Chaney, who's already doing this little bubble of his own little creative universe. You've got Browning, who's wanting to do that. And then the two come together, and they're a perfect fit, or an imperfect fit, if you'd prefer.
Yeah, I mean, Chaney couldn't have existed in any other era.
The weird thing about Chaney as well is that in 1928 and 29, he was the top male box office star in Hollywood. He was the Tom Cruise of the late 1920s. And it was for the very films that we're talking about today. They were massive with audiences. He was bigger than the other big stars around at the time were Tom Mix, the big cowboy star, who had been the box office champion, I think, the year before, 1926 or 27, and Rudolph Valentino, who seemed to have fallen out of favour. And so you'd got Valentino, the matinee idol, you'd got Tom Mix, you'd got the great comedians, of course, of the day, Keaton, Laurel and Hardy, Chaplin. Chaney, for 2 years, in 1928 and 29, right in the wake of these films, and right at the period where he was working with Browning, was the biggest male box office star in the world. What was happening with audiences to make that the case?
Well, it's interesting because, I guess with music as well. I mean, one of the things I I don't watch live TV, and I don't watch BBC Four anymore. But I used to watch BBC Four back in the day, and what I kind of got bored with was their constant, and it's like the Six musification and the BBC Four narratives on music. They've got their own narratives, and they're not going to shift from that. The 90s was just Oasis and Blur, that's it. And it's like, fucking, there's so much more happening in that decade, bad shit and good shit. And I don't like this kind of whitewashing or reimagining history to suit your own narrative purposes. But I think we do that with Hollywood, and I think you're absolutely right. And if you look back, what's nice when I'm doing research and stuff, I mean, you've got the Internet Archive now, and you've got tons of issues of Variety magazine from back, from sort of the 1910s, 20s. And if you can be bothered, if you can spend the time sifting through that, because I was looking, when I was talking about The Unknown at the Broadway a few weeks back, I was sifting through, to find reviews of The Unknown. And, we've been led to believe certain narratives about Hollywood, particularly in the 20s and 30s, of who was most famous and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, you're right. It's not that narrative is not always correct. If you look at those magazines, they reflect a different way that people were feeling about films and the characters that they were a lot of films that we have absolutely forgotten now would have been huge at the time.
Oh yeah. I mean, we know how many silent films have been lost, and there's that whole history there that we're never going to know about. But yeah, Chaney was the #1 box office star. The only person above him in the listings was Clara Bow.
And most people have forgotten who Clara Bow is now,
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Outside of kind of cult, nerdy film people,
Yeah.
You say Clara Bow, don't know.
Yeah, but Chaney's still an icon. People know what the Phantom of the Opera is. They know what the Hunchback is. They even know his character from London After Midnight, even though that's a lost film. These are images that still resonate today. Now, talking about how Browning and Chaney sort of changed public perception in a way and brought this weirdness into the limelight. We've actually seen an example of that in our lifetimes. And again, it's coming back to a name we've already mentioned. Don't you agree with me that Tim Burton did that around 1990, 91, 92? I think the specific film that did it was Batman Returns. I think you look at Batman Returns, and it's such a Tod Browning movie that they have this circus imagery. And that wave of early Tim Burton films, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Batman, Edward Scissorhands, Batman Returns, I think changed a mass audience perception and led us to where we are now with things like Game of Thrones and Walking Dead having become big. I think that all stems from those Tim Burton films, and audiences going along to see the first Batman, loving it, loving the gothic atmosphere of it, which I think not many people expected, and then sticking with Burton, sticking with that vision, and realizing that this dark stuff's actually good, isn't it? And that was getting through. Me and you and the people we know already knew all that by 1990, but there were a hell of a lot of people who didn't, and I think they were sort of educated by Tim Burton. But of course, Burton had learned all that from people like Lon Chaney and Tod Browning.
And James Whale. There's a lot of James Whale in Burton.
Indeed. Yeah,
I think you're right, and I think it's easy to forget just how interesting a filmmaker he was for a while. I think it's just a shame he kind of became a parody of himself. I think
Burton's career almost parallels Browning. There are so many sort of similarities, and even even if you look at the rise, the stardom, and then the fall and the decline, they're almost identical to what happened in Browning's film career. I think the only thing Burton didn't do that Tod Browning did was run away to the circus, and I bet he wishes he had done, but
As far as I know, he didn't get pissed, have a car crash, and lose his testicles. As far as we know.
Well, he could be keeping that quiet. That might explain a lot if it had happened. But yeah, they've even got the same initials, for God's sake. You know, it's yeah. So there are parallels there, and I think what Tim Burton's film career does is it shows a modern audience what the impact of Tod Browning was in the 20s. When you look at these film charts and you see, oh yeah, Lon Chaney wasn't just a popular star, he was the biggest star in the world. He was the biggest male star in the world for making these films, you know. And I think for audiences to understand that, look at that quartet of Tim Burton films between sort of 1987 and 92 and see the impact that they had on cinema. Take that back 60 or 70 years, and that's where Browning and Chaney sit.
I think I kind of mentioned this. I think it was on the last one, or maybe the one before that. Um, I think that even close to home, I think there was a resurgence. Maybe it was just from my filtered view of the kind of weird and uncanny stuff around that time. So obviously it was happening with Burton, and you're seeing that on the screen, this gothic weirdness presented to us, in the form of a superhero movie. But because I was talking about the other day, the Channel 4, people tend to look at Channel 4, the early Channel 4, oh, it's subversive and all this. I don't think it hit its stride till much later on. I think it's more sort of the end of the 80s, mid to late 80s, early 90s, when you were getting all those repeats of the Twilight Zone and or new stuff like Secret Cabaret and all this kind of stuff, or 40 and TV, which came later on. There was kind of this weirdness at the end of the 80s and early 90s. And I think,
and BBC Two were doing that at the time, possibly in competition with Channel 4, and it's weird how you got this stuff where you'd got a lot of retro programming, like Twilight Zone and Outer Limits were coming back and being shown at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, but both channels would mix those in with new programming that had a similar sensibility.
I remember because the BBC Two had Mystery Train, didn't they, with Richard O'Brien, which people have kind of forgotten about now. It's really difficult to get any sort of because I remember it very clearly, and I loved it because it was just so fucking odd. And I remember they showed like some of the early David Lynch animations and short films, and they used to show Duckman around the same time as well, which was a really bizarre animated series. It was brilliant.
I suppose this was the early days of late night and 24-hour TV, wasn't it? And I think in those early days, it was like, what are we if the controller's telling us to put things on at 2 o'clock in the morning, what are we going to show? And it was great. ITV, I remember, was showing like old 1950s and 60s British B movies and a lot of very weird ones, but BBC Two and Channel 4 both had these sort of programming ideas where they would mix and match vintage content of a strange variety with new material of a strange variety, and it may have simply been that right, we've decided that we're going to show TV into the small hours, but what the fuck do we put on?
Well, I remember, I mean, just very quickly, I remember seeing Night of the Living Dead and Carnival of Souls. You'd think, oh, well, BBC Two, Channel 4. No, it was on ITV because ITV was buying up. Night of the Living Dead went through a long time where there was anybody could kind of release it and show it or whatever. And things like Carnival of Souls, because there weren't these kind of deals being cut out. But so first time I ever saw Carnival of Souls was on ITV late at about 1:30 in the morning or something. And that's when you should see Carnival of Souls for the first time, when you're kind of falling asleep and watching it thinking, what the fuck is this?
Imagine coming home from the pub and switching on the TV and seeing The Unknown at 2 o'clock in the morning. You'd freak out.
Yeah. Anyway, Darrell, have you got a quick plug for us? Anything coming up through We Belong Dead?
Yes, we've got the new issue of We Belong Dead is in preparation. The current one, as I say, is a blaxploitation special, which is out now. Issue 39 is in preparation. We've got loads of stuff planned for next year. we've got the Euro horror book coming out from We Be Long Dead 2, and that should be out any time. It's all finished, all prepared. We're just waiting to sort out a printer on it. And as I say, I'm doing stuff at Quad as well. We've got The Exorcist coming up as our Fright Club for December, and we've got more shows planned for later in the year, in 2024. I've also I've got an essay in the booklet of the release of Mausoleum, which is coming out. My pals at Treasured Films imminently, so look out for that. And I'll be working with those guys on some of their new releases too. And also in February next year, I've already got stuff in the diary for next year. We've got the UK Ghost Story Festival back in Derby, which is an annual event in Derby early in the year. My friend Alex Davis runs that, and I'll be doing a lecture as part of that weekend in February. I'm doing a talk called Inner Ghosts, which is going to be all about imaginary friends on film. And I'm also doing, that same weekend, I'm doing my Horror Walk of Derby, which is a little walking tour around the city centre where I point out little sites of interest involving figures like Bela Lugosi and Todd Slaughter, amongst others. So if you didn't realise that Derby city centre was a sort of haven for horror, come on my walk in February. So so plenty going on here, and hopefully more to come later in the year. So as you know, Andrew, the horror conveyor belt never stops, does it?
No. Excellent. So so it just remains for me to say, make sure you check us out on Facebook. Make sure you listen to us wherever you listen to your podcast, and if you get a minute, just give us a review, give us a good review, because it really, I know people say this, but it genuinely helps to get the podcast out there to other people, so please do that. But it just remains for me to say thank you to my guest, Darrell Buxton. Cheers, Darrell.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. Always great to talk about silent horror.
So remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.